So now that we know the budget line and the indifference curve, let's evaluate the consumer equilibrium in consumption. So let's start with these two with these two curves, the indifference curve like this one and the budget line like this one. Notice that this indifference curve is crossing the budget line at 2 points, but we're going to assume that the consumer is right here at point A, where the consumer is buying, is using all his money or all her money in the two goods. Now, is this consumer maximizing the happiness the consumer has? Well, there's different ways of seeing this. If you see it graphically, you can tell that if that indifference curve exists, then there must be another indifference curve to the right of that one that doesn't touch it, but the consumer can also afford. And if the consumer is happier in I2 to I1, then the consumer should actually buy I2. And there's probably another indifference curve to the right of that one that the consumer can afford. And if the consumer can afford I3, since the consumer is happy at I3, the consumer should actually buy I3. So if you're applying that logic, essentially you're going to continue to move to an indifference curve that is higher and higher. And at the end of this process, you're going to end with the consumer consuming in an indifference curve that is just tangent to, just touching that budget line. And that indifference curve will be the one that the consumer wants to achieve. So the equilibrium for a consumer, or the point at which the consumer is maximizing the happiness given the money or the income the consumer has, is at a point in which the indifference curve and the budget line are tangent. So they're just the last possible place or the last possible indifference curve this consumer can actually achieve given that budget line. Now here's another way of explaining the same thing. So notice that at A, the slope of the indifference curve, the slope of indifference curve is actually larger than the slope in absolute term than the slope of the budget line. It's more inclined than the slope of the budget line. So what does that mean? It means that if we assume, let's say that the slope of the budget line is something like -4, the slope of the indifference curve, then the slope of the budget line has to be less than that. So let's say that the slope of the budget line, BL slope, is actually -2. So what that means is that this consumer values X. Remember that the slope of the budget, that the difference curve is the value the consumer has for X. The consumer value X at 4Y, but the consumer only has to pay 2Y to actually buy 1X in the market. So in other words, this consumer can buy X at 2Y in the market, and yet he's willing to give up 4. So clearly this consumer is getting a bargain on X, so this consumer should probably buy more X. So in other words, when the budget line is not tangent to the indifference curve, this consumer can actually find in the market a price that is lower than the value he has for the goods. So therefore, the consumer should probably switch consumption. And you're not going to have that when the consumer is at a point that is tangent between the budget line and the indifference curve. And at that point, the slopes of both curves are the same. Now, one thing that you didn't see the algebra video, you haven't found out, is that the slope of the budget line is equal to the ratio of the prices, and you can take this by definition if you want. The slope of this red line, or the budget line, is always going to be the ratio of the prices, Px over Py. So what I'm saying here is that when the consumer maximizes happiness at this point B, the slope of the budget line, which is the ratio of the prices, is going to be the same as the slope of the indifference curve, which, remember, that is the value of X, or the rate at which the consumer is willing to trade one good for the other.